The Christchurch 360 Trail is 130 kilometres of walking tracks that circumnavigate Christchurch through suburbs, wetlands and hills. We'll stop at all the interesting spots along the way, take a few side trips and dig into the city's natural history and its human history. Join me for this 360-degree nerd's eye view of Christchurch. Last time we walked from the Ōtakaro Avon River at Riccarton Bush to the Ōpāwaho Heathcote River in Hillmorton. In this episode, we'll follow the Ōpāwaho back towards its source and then head south to Halswell Quarry at the foot of the Port Hills. Leaving Seeker Park and the Sunnyside Heritage Garden onto Lincoln Road, we do a bit of a loop to cross Curlett's Road and are confronted with a high concrete wall. A wall that separates the Carmelite Monastery from the outside world. During the Third Crusade in the 12th century, a group of hermits following the prophet Elijah made their home in caves on Mount Carmel in what's now Israel. They were looking for peace and quiet, which is not really what the Crusades were about. The first convent for Carmelite nuns was opened in France in the mid-15th century. One was opened in Sydney in 1885, and 7 nuns from Sydney founded the Christchurch Monastery in 1933. We can't see what goes on behind these walls, but presumably it involves poverty, chastity and obedience. Behind the monastery is the entrance to Canterbury Park, and we'll follow the Heathcote along the park's edge. The park is home to the sale yards where sheep and cattle are auctioned every Tuesday. This operation has been running in various locations since 1874, and these days 20,000 head of cattle and 180,000 sheep are put up for sale annually. Every November the park hosts the A&P, or Agricultural and Pastoral Show. It's been running since 1862 and has become a fixture on the Christchurch calendar, so much so that the Friday of show weekend is a public holiday in Canterbury. The original showground was what's now Sydenham Park. In 1887 the show moved to the Addington Showgrounds, later known as Rugby League Park, AMI Stadium, Orange Theory Stadium and now Apollo Project Stadium. It remained there for over 100 years, moving to Canterbury Park in 1997. Despite seeing 125,000 visitors in 2023, the 2024 show was cancelled due to financial problems. The A&P Association's General Committee opposed the board's decision, the board resigned, and as of the moment of writing, there'll be a rebranded event called the Christchurch Show, which, we are assured, will definitely resemble an agricultural show. The Wigram East Basin is the second part of the Upper Heathcote storage scheme. It's 4 times the size of the Curlett's Basin and can hold 520 million litres of water. That's about 200 Olympic-sized swimming pools, or, in equally scientific units, about 2,000 double-decker buses full of water, enough to handle a 100-year flood. Normally, the water loops through the wetland and is piped out to the river. Like at Curlett's, outflow is controlled by floodgates, and when heavy rainfall occurs, the outflows from here are coordinated with the outflows from the other basins to minimise downstream flooding. In extreme weather, the water overflows an emergency spillway in the flood bank. After heavy rainfall in 2012 and 2014, the river burst its banks and houses were flooded. When the same amount of rain fell in 2021 after the basin upgrade, there was surface flooding but no serious damage. Leaving Canterbury Park, take the track to the left that follows the river and you'll come to the Eel Bridge. The river widens and slows here, and a bed of short fin eels congregates in the shallow, shady pools. The eels spawn in an unknown location in the Western Pacific, and the leptocephali, the tiny eel larvae, are transported to New Zealand on the East Australian Current.
Listen, I need to get to the East Australian Current, EAC.
Oh, dude, you're riding it, dude!
Here, they fatten up on discarded fish heads and second-hand cat food provided by the locals, and 20 or 30 years later, head back to the ocean to breed. Continuing the watery theme, next door is the Ngā Puna Sports Hub. Ngā Puna Wai means many spring waters, referring to the artesian water sources in the area. Ngā Puna Wai was opened in 2019 to replace the QE2 sports complex lost in the earthquake. During construction, the site was filled with material excavated when Wigram East Basin was enlarged, killing two birds with one stone. And by killing two birds, I mean providing a wetland sanctuary for thousands of birds. And by one stone, I mean thousands of tons of dirt. Anyway, the complex has facilities for netball and various other indoor sports and is home to athletics, hockey, tennis, and rugby league from community to international level. The Christchurch 360 trail used to follow the St John of God Remembrance path along the river. There's not much to see here anymore. The path was closed in 2020. At the other end of the path, a private road goes up to the St John of God Hospital and Chapel, which was damaged in the earthquakes and has been fenced off. The chapel was originally the Catholic church at Mount Magdala, run by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. If we take the route you're supposed to follow, we loop around the other side of the hospital and Halswell Residential College. Partway round is the Mount Magdala Cemetery of the Good Shepherd Sisters. Most of the graves are unmarked. One of those buried here is Mother Aidan Phelan, Mother Superior of Mount Magdala. Mother Aidan Phelan got her name from Saint Aidan of Lindisfarne and, in turn, gave her name to the suburb of Aidanfield. The land around here was owned by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd for 100 years. The sale of the land for residential development starting around 2000 funds their charitable work. We rejoin the Ōpāwaho Heathcote at Nash Reserve. There's some impressive flood protection work, but the river here is just a ditch, if not completely dry. Over time, the springs that feed the river have been moving east, leaving this part of the riverbed dry. As we wound through the suburbs of Aidanfield and Westlake, we crossed another divide between the Ōpāwaho Heathcote catchment and the Huritini Halswell River catchment. The river flows south from here into Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. The Westlake ponds are two old gravel pits that have been converted into lakes and are now considered sites of ecological significance because of the bird life they support. Westlake is an important stop on the flyway between Lake Ellesmere and Ihutai, the Avon Heathcote estuary. The ponds serve as a feeding and roosting habitat for the endangered black-billed gull and many other species. The ponds are drained by Nottingham Stream and will roughly follow its path through Oaklands to Halswell, although it runs through people's back gardens, so we won't see much of it. We'll catch another glimpse as it flows past St Peter and Paul Catholic Church on its way to the Halswell River. Flows might be generous. Oaklands was built up in the 1960s and 70s. Many of the houses along Wales Street are of Summerhill stone, a popular cladding material at the time. Summerhill stone is an imitation stone made of concrete and was popular because it was cheap, durable, and could be coloured in all the ways that people in the 1970s loved, before the real estate industry decided everything had to be beige or grey. On Nichols Road is the Santa Rosa homestead. Before Oaklands was Oaklands, this whole area was the Santa Rosa stud farm. Today, just the house remains. In the early 20th century, Santa Rosa was the country's most successful harness stud. Stallions like Harold Dillon, Great Audubon and Peter Rita sired or dam-sired several New Zealand Trotting Cup winners. Stud owner Robert Macmillan was killed in an accident in 1923 when the car he was travelling in was hit by the West Coast Express train at a level crossing in Hornby. After the accident, the farm was sold and lost its top-ranking place, eventually closing, the land being sold for residential development. Macmillan's funeral procession travelled the short distance to St Mary's Anglican Church, where he was buried. St Mary's is not on the 360 trail, but it's worth the short side trip. It was the first church on the plains south of Christchurch, designed, like so many early churches, by Benjamin Mountfort, built in 1863. A Victorian Gothic lich gate opens into the graveyard. St Mary's is the final resting place of Sir John Craycroft Wilson. John Craycroft Wilson was a civil servant in India. He came to Christchurch and named his farm Kashmir after his favourite part of India. He was a Member of Parliament for 15 years in the 1860s and 70s. The Christchurch 360 Trail doesn't go through Kashmir, so that might be a topic for another video. Nearby is the grave of Harry Ell. He was also an MP and was the driving force behind the creation of the reserves in the Port Hills and of the Summit Road. We'll hear a lot more about Harry Ell in the next section of the walk. Halswell was a town separate from Christchurch until recently. Suburbs have gradually filled in the gap. Oaklands was built in the 1960s, Westlake in the 80s, and Aidanfield in the 90s and 2000s. When Captain Joseph Thomas surveyed Canterbury in 1848 and 49, he thought it would be politically correct to name all the lakes, rivers and mountains after members of the Canterbury Association. Edmund Halswell, a London lawyer who was briefly a judge in New Zealand and Commissioner of Native Reserves, was one of the few members who had ever been to New Zealand, and he got a river named after him. The village that eventually grew near the head of the river took the name Halswell. In Halswell village, there's a butcher, a greengrocer, a dairy, a fish and chip shop, but apparently no intellectual property lawyers. The first shop in Halswell was the post office in the triangle between Halswell Road and Kennedy's Bush Road. The store burned down in 1925 and was soon replaced. Today, it's a vet's surgery. Here's a customer leaving a review. Across the road is the community centre opened in 1913, home to the Halswell Residents Association and various other groups. Heading down Kennedy's Bush Road, we come to Halswell School. The school opened in 1864 and is where Harry Ell began his education. The school expanded over the years as Halswell became less rural. The buildings here date from 2015, after all the previous buildings were written off after the earthquakes. Halswell is still growing and residential development is expanding into the gap between here and the old quarry. The Quarry Park contains gardens celebrating Christchurch's sister cities across the world. In the Songpa Garden, these Zhengxiong guardian poles ward off evil spirits. If you visit the Kurashiki Garden in springtime, you can take pictures of people taking pictures of the cherry blossom. The Quarry Rim Track is a short walk that takes us round the old quarry workings. From 1860 to 1990, Halswell Quarry provided building materials for some of Christchurch's most recognisable buildings, although a lot of the rock was crushed to make base course for roads and the airport runway. The quarry started as a volcanic blister on the side of the Lyttelton volcano a few million years after the main eruption. It never broke the surface and the lava cooled in place, jointing into the thick slabs that our early builders made such good use of. If you want to know more about the quarry, I've got another video dedicated to it. Next time, we'll follow the track out of the quarry and make the climb up through Kennedy's Bush to the Summit Road, the partial realisation of Harry Ell's dream, and visit a couple of his rest houses. We'll get our first view over the crater rim and see where TV used to come from before we had YouTube. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for part 3 of this 360-degree Nerd's Eye view of Christchurch.